The Boss OD-3 has been my benchmark overdrive pedal for a while now, and while I've featured it on this channel a lot, I've never actually done a straight up review of it. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go through some of the things I think it does really well as some of the things I think it doesn't do quite so well at, and offer some alternatives along the way. Probably the most important thing to realise about the OD-3 is that it's a full range, a full frequency range amp type overdrive pedal. It is not a tube screamer. You know, a tube screamer has that hump in the mids that I think make it really good at when you're playing through an amp that's already overdriven and you just want to push the mids a bit. The OD-3 doesn't do that. The OD-3 is much flatter in EQ, and I think it shines best when you're playing through either an amp that's completely clean or an amp that's only slightly overdriven, so just on the edge of breakup. And in that setup, I think the OD-3 just imparts this really nice natural amp type vintage overdrive sound. I'll compare the OD-3 to this standard TS9 Ibanez tube screamer and see if you can hear that difference in EQ. Not only does the general EQ and breakup of the OD-3 have this natural amp-like quality to it, but it also stacks really well with other pedals in the same way an amp's overdrive would. So in the same way that Jimi Hendrix would, you know, play a fuzz face pedal into a Marshall amp, and that Marshall amp would revoice the sound of the fuzz face a little bit, the OD-3 can do a similar thing. So I'll play a fuzz and distortion pedal into the OD-3 and see if you can hear how the OD-3 it doesn't focus the sound into the mids too much like a tube screamer type pedal might, but it just rounds off some of the harsh edges. You know, it takes out just a little bit of the fizzy high end and just tightens up some of the lower frequencies. When you compare that to a fuzz or distortion pedal going straight into a clean amp, that sound can be quite abrasive and harsh sometimes. See if you can hear what I'm talking about. Okay, let's move on to the controls. So the volume and tone controls work as you would expect. There's loads of volume available, so you don't have to worry about that. And the tone control is a standard high pass filter that you get on most overdrive pedals. Just be aware that the OD-3 has quite a natural, open, high-end airiness to it, and it's very difficult to tune out that high end using the tone control. The kind of broadness on the high pass filter is just too much. You end up making your main guitar sound quite dull if you try and do it that way. So just be aware that natural airy high end is just kind of the nature of the OD-3, especially on lower gain settings. See if you can hear what I'm talking about when I use the tone control here, and if you're not into that airy high end, then I've got some suggestions that I'll talk about in a minute. There's a really wide range of gain on the drive control, and it can go from that sort of edge of breakup sound on the lowest setting all the way up to a super saturated heavy overdrive that's almost verging on distortion with the higher drive settings. It won't go completely clean on the lower settings unless you have maybe like really low output pickups, or if you roll the volume on your guitar down a little bit, which it does respond really well to at any gain level. Most people I hear who like the OD3 tend to set the drive control about halfway or lower. I think a big reason for that is because on the higher drive settings, the sound does tend to compress a lot, and I don't think, in my opinion, it suits the kind of overall vintage sound of the OD3 with those more modern high gain settings. If you are into those high gain settings though, I've got some alternatives coming later, but just be aware that the OD3 kind of shines best most of the time with the gain set slightly lower. Might help you decide whether the OD3 is for you or not is to consider what types of pickups are in your guitar. So remember, the OD3 has quite an open, airy high end, and with most medium and high output pickups, I find that works just great. You know, it opens up the sound nicely. But if you have really low output single coil pickups like I have in this Strat, then the sound of those are often kind of quite open and airy anyway. So when you put the OD3 on, there can just be too much presence, you know, and remember, it's that kind of super high end which is difficult to tune out just using the tone control on the pedal. If that's your situation and you find that the OD3 is just too bright for you, then I have a few suggestions. If it's only on the bridge pickup when it happens, then you can just maybe get by rolling down the tone control a little bit, as long as you have a tone control wired to that bridge pickup. That might get you by. Another option would be to use an EQ pedal and just tune out that super high-end frequency there. But it may be that the OD3 is just not for you, in which case the next best pedal I'd recommend is probably the Nobel's ODR1, which has a similar kind of amp-like overdrive quality to it, I think, but the high end is a little easier to get along with, and it just rolls off a little bit more. It's just a bit softer, particularly when you're using single coil pickups and particularly low output single coil pickups. I've got a whole video comparing these two, which I'll link above, but I'll do a quick comparison here and see if you can hear that difference in the high end. I hear the overdrive sound of the OD3 as being quite a vintage voiced overdrive sound. If you're after something modern, then there's plenty of options. I like the full tone OCD, the Boss ST2 or OD1X are good options there. All kind of amp-like overdrive pedals that have a slightly more modern sound to them than the OD3. If, like me, you're just really into the OD3 and you want to try and make it work for everything, then a nice workaround I've found is to use an EQ pedal after the OD3, set it to a kind of modern mid scoop, and then you've got access to some pretty monstrous modern high gain settings. Check it out. Personally, I think one of the most appealing things about the OD3 is just its simplicity. You know, it's 3 knobs, it sounds great, and it does what it does. If you need more options and tweakability, I think you can do a lot worse than something like the Origin Effects Revival Drive Compact, where there's lots of options to fine tune. And just be aware, when I compared those two pedals, that the actual overall quality of the overdrive sound didn't necessarily improve much, if at all. It was more about the ability to fine tune to your rig or your setup or whatever sound you want. That's, I think, what you're paying for in a more expensive pedal like that. Another thing I get asked sometimes is what year my OD3 is from, and I've done comparisons with brand new ones against old ones from the year of release, and at least in terms of sound, I can't hear a difference. You know, new or old, it'll sound like an OD3. So know that that's something you don't have to worry about. I've got a full video on that comparison if you're interested, because there are some differences in the build design and stuff. I've also got a full playlist of all my videos that feature the OD3, which you might want to check out. And if you found this video interesting, think about liking the video and subscribing to the channel.